Hello, everyone. My name is Tracy Osborne, and I'm an associate professor at the University of California, Merced, and I'm also the director of the UC Center for Climate Justice. And I'll be serving as the moderator for today's panel on environmental and climate justice. Climate change is an urgent existential crisis, and centering justice will be critical for addressing our most pressing social and environmental concerns in the most comprehensive, equitable, and effective ways. Environmental justice is a paradigm that suggests that all communities, regardless of race, ethnicity, class, or gender, or any identity or expression of difference, should be treated equally with regards to environmental laws and the distribution of positive and negative environmental attributes. Of course, in the US and around the world, we often have found the most marginalized people are disproportionately impacted by the presence of toxic industries. Climate justice recognizes the disproportionate impact of climate change on marginalized people around the world, and these are the people and places least responsible for the problem in the first place. It also connects the dots between the climate crisis and a range of social, racial, and environmental justice issues in which people are deeply entangled. And this engages a larger and more diverse group of people. Climate justice also takes a systems perspective and attempts to address the root causes of climate change, as opposed to the symptoms alone. And these are critically important issues that our panelists are at the forefront of doing this work through research, teaching, policymaking, and engagement. Our panelists include Chitra Kumar, Assistant Director of Environmental Justice in the United States Environmental Protection Agency, Daphne Lundy, Deputy Director for Social Resiliency in New York City Mayor's Office of Climate Resiliency, and Kyle White, George Willis Peck Professor in the School of Environmental and Sustainability at the University of Michigan. So each speaker will have about 10 to 12 minutes, and then at the end we'll pose a set of questions to the panel. Our first speaker will be Chitra Kumar. Ms. Kumar is a public policy and planning expert at the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency. Throughout her nearly 20-year federal career, she has held various roles, creating partnerships with federal, state, and local organizations to develop more equitable strategies for environmental protection, land use, and infrastructure, particularly in economically distressed small towns, rural areas, and urban neighborhoods. Currently, Chitra is Assistant Director for EPA's Office of Environmental Justice. Chitra holds a master's in city planning from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology and a bachelor's of arts from Boston University. And so now I'll turn it over to Chitra Kumar.
Thank you so much for that warm introduction, Dr. Osborne, and thank you so much to the American Geographical Society for inviting me here to this panel today. So as Dr. Osborne said in the bio, that I'm with the Environmental Protection Agency. I am going to provide some remarks sort of based on how I see from my vantage point with the federal agency, the national picture of the foundations that have been laid for addressing climate justice by starting with environmental justice. And I'll then share some thoughts and ideas about opportunities moving forward, given the era that we're in, with new resources and new energy to try to address climate with a justice lens. So in order to do justice to that justice, I will, pardon the pun, I'm going to share my slides, some slides that have some visuals, because we are at a Geographical Society event, and it's we always have to recognize, or I definitely recognize, that the importance of maps and spatial analysis to enabling environmental justice advocates to getting the attention on this issue, because pictures and maps do speak volumes. So this, for example, is a graphic of how current environmental disparities have their roots in systematic racism. So our colleagues at California EPA overlaid the digitized redlining maps for the city of Oakland, California, with their mapping tool, CalEnviroScreen. And you can see the correlation right here between the areas classified as D, hazardous, or the worst environment, and environmental disparities today. And then you can see also how this was intentional. It was known by the surveyor's descriptions on the right-hand side of this slide, this box where it says odors and noises from local industries, infiltration of colored and orientals, predominance of older cheap cottages, zoned for industry. And then further down, adjoining industrial area with attendant odors and smoke. So this is not an accident that people were co-located with noxious facilities and industry. And these very much were in full consciousness and accepted at that time. Sorry. Now, what are we doing about it? We are really moving to the environmental protection practice or enterprise in the federal government started out with trying to provide equality. This diagram, which is very commonly used to explain these terms, I'm just going to reference here because equality was about providing a very average level of improvement. And what that meant for environmental protection is providing that better air or cleaner water or less land contamination on average. It didn't address the fact that there were hot spots in this community, in certain communities. And those communities tended to be communities of color, low-income communities that had less clout. Now we're trying to address those things by providing better, safer water, not just to some, but actually addressing the conditions, the root causes, by fixing the systems. And what does that mean? Well, back in 1992, we had an environmental equity work group. And then that work group was by many prominent environmental justice leaders who had that set up at the Environmental Protection Agency. And that equity work group or task force advocated for an environmental justice office to be set up at EPA so that it would, and that was set up and signed by executive order by Bill Clinton back in 1994. And we then were off and running and creating tools, structures, trying to influence the rest of federal government, starting with the Environmental Protection Agency, through a series of work groups and task force and guides and plans, but without the full force of accountability of any legislation or any regulation that forced anyone to actually implement what was put in these wonderful guidebooks and promising practice reports. So we were very crafty. We put together, for example, one of our very prized things that we did was put together something called EJ Screen, a nationally consistent mapping tool using national data sets. And what it could do, and it can do, is, for example, this is a map of Philadelphia and the city of Philadelphia, again, referencing the idea of these redlining maps. You have from 1938 a redlining map. You pay attention on the left-hand side to the red and yellow areas on that map. And then in the middle, Philadelphia happens to have, at the tract level, blood lead level data, which is available and mapped right here. And you can see the high correlation between the dots on the map and where you have the redlined areas. Well, not all cities have that level of specificity in their data. So EJ Screen on the right-hand side is able to actually showcase and show how the indices for lead paint enable you to see some of those same areas. Mostly captures there's tremendous overlap between the dots and the red areas that you see on this map. So it's a great proxy. And we can do this in any city where there's the lead paint information is available. So this can be a really powerful tool for advocates on legacy environmental issues. And now we're moving into an era where we not only have these powerful tools, but we have a new administration who has from day one provided backing and leadership, saying we have to address through executive orders racial equity and issues of underserved communities, through an executive order on tackling the climate crisis at home and abroad, through messages from our administrator saying it has to be a clear priority for the Environmental Protection Agency. But not only that, we are going to give you money through the budget, through the congressional budget process, through the American Rescue Plan. We are going to provide the resources to use the tools and shift the conversation from where it has been, which is primarily around equality, to equity, and then all the way to justice on these issues. So one thing I want to just highlight for you on how a mechanism for that is within the executive order on tackling the climate crisis at home and abroad, there is something called Justice 40. It's an initiative that commits 40% of the resources of certain programs to benefit disadvantaged communities. It is a really interesting concept of trying to drive the benefits, not just the dollars, but the benefits towards disadvantaged communities. It includes a scorecard that is supposed to be set up, so to have that accountability and transparency. It also has set up a White House Environmental Justice Council for broad stakeholder engagement and specific elevated attention to environmental justice leaders and their voice in public policy. This is really significant because the EJ office, the Environmental Protection Agency, had a certain amount of convening power, but the White House is a whole nother level. And even maybe because of, but maybe in spite of anything the federal government is doing, we have seen so much attention at the state level as well. Governor Murphy in New Jersey signed legislation on environmental justice, which is catapulting their work forward. We see here on the right-hand side a number of other states that are also doing interesting things, whether it's legislative or executive orders that are pushing environmental justice forward. We even see utility regulators thinking about and conversing about equity and justice. So this is a really exciting time for us to move forward with an equity and justice lens. Lastly, I'll just share this one more tool, and the Indiana University has pulled together some information about other maps and mapping tools on environmental justice throughout the country, which is an interesting resource, and they share indicators that each of these states are using. And it's something worth noting that 19 states do have their own maps and tools and resources. So this is just a really fruitful time. And key takeaways in terms of what's coming forward as we look ahead, we really want to see environmental justice in all of the procedures, policies, and programs, not only for EPA, but all of the agencies throughout federal government. We're excited to see that there's money flowing towards those programs. It's not just good ideas, but we're backing those ideas with money. That's happening through even the congressional conversations that are appropriations conversations that are happening right now on the Hill, whether it's the infrastructure bill or reconciliation process. We want to also note that it's so important to build transparency and accountability into everything we do, because that is what will give leaders on the ground the opportunity to make sure that this sticks beyond any one administration. We also want to be able to continue to invest in all these kinds of tools as we tackle the climate challenge, but not lose sight of the legacy environmental problems and the communities that have been fighting so hard for those issues as well, because that is something that often can happen in these conversations. So with that, I will turn it back over to Dr. Osborn. Here's my contact information if anyone would like to reach out afterwards. Thank you so much.
That was fantastic. So our next speaker will be Ms. Daphne Lundy. Ms. Lundy is Deputy Director for Social Resiliency at the New York City Mayor's Office of Resiliency. Her work is focused on creating programs that strengthen and prepare New York City communities against climate change impacts. Projects include supporting education programs to increase awareness of heat waves and heat risk in vulnerable communities, expanding green infrastructure investments that mitigate urban heat island effect, and identifying building retrofitting strategies. Prior to that, she was an urban planner at the New York City Department of City Planning, working on resilient land use and zoning policy for Brooklyn coastal communities impacted by Hurricane Sandy. So thank you so much. Daphne, please go ahead and go ahead with your presentation.
Thanks for those introductions, Dr. Osborn and Chitra. Really appreciate your framing of the federal level and the work that's being done on that level. So I'll be spending some time talking about what's happening in New York City, particularly around extreme heat, and the way that our policies around extreme heat adaptation is really thinking about the work through a climate justice lens and a lot of the underlying inequalities that drive a lot of the vulnerability in New York City. So, I'm sure that this audience, especially since it's a geography conference, knows sort of the landscape of risk in the city and nationwide. I think that when people think about risk in New York City specifically, they'll think about the Hurricane Sandys or the major coastal storms that affect our city. But in reality, it's a real kind of multi-hazard landscape that we face when we're thinking about risk. And I wanted to zoom in on extreme heat because even though when we see a Sandy-like event, we know that there's a lot of physical destruction, when it comes to actual well-being and life and safety, it's really extreme heat that's a driver of a lot of vulnerability in the city and nationwide. So, what we find is that lots of places like New York City tend to be a lot hotter than their surrounding areas because of the urban heat island effect. What that means practically is that every summer in the city, several hundred people are hospitalized or experience heat illness. And so much of this is sort of driven by these known and understood inequalities in our built environment. Everything from lack of air conditioning or differences in housing quality or housing access, or even sort of underlying health issues that drive certain people to be more vulnerable when there's a heat wave. And, I'm really happy that Chitra brought in the redlining maps in her presentation, because when we think about heat risk and sort of the impact of it, what we know is that it's not evenly felt across the city. It's really sort of spatially defined by a lot of underlying inequalities. And so the map on the left is the city's redlining maps from the 40s. And, as this audience likely knows, redlining maps were what sort of indicated, where you could get a mortgage, where investments were being made, what was deemed a safe or undesirable neighborhood. And a study that came out I think in 2019, sort of pre the COVID pandemic, did an analysis of redlining maps across the country. And so in doing this analysis, they found that neighborhoods that were deemed hazardous, so neighborhoods that were redlined, were the neighborhoods today that faced the greatest heat vulnerability. And a lot of this is tied to the fact that these hazardous neighborhoods were neighborhoods where investments weren't being made. So everything from thinking about, the lack of green space, or the fact that the housing stock in these neighborhoods were oftentimes subpar. These historical policy decisions are now meaning that these same neighborhoods face greater risk in the summer months. I once heard Dr. Maybelle Wilson, who's a professor out of Columbia, say that landscapes are not neutral. And I think that's something we really need to keep in mind when doing work to address environmental justice and climate justice. There's oftentimes all of these sort of underlining inequalities in our landscape that we really have to sort of keep front of mind when we're addressing climate hazards, in the city, but also nationwide. So another layer I wanted to add on to this is how we think about climate risk as it relates to public health. And so oftentimes in my role at the Office of Climate Resiliency, we're thinking about the climate hazard, so the flooding event or the extreme heat event, but then we're also thinking about the secondary hazards and then the overall impact on public health. And so in the case of extreme heat, it's not just thinking about the heat wave event itself, but it's also thinking about the impact on air quality. It's also thinking about the impact on things like, respiratory illness or people who have asthma who might feel the impact of the heat wave more significantly. And so in sort of trying to craft solutions to address climate risk, we really have to be doing it in this robust way that considers both these historic inequalities as well as these underlying impacts, to public health and health disparities in general. So in 2017, the city of New York launched Cool Neighborhoods NYC. And so this was the city's first heat adaptation plan. And this tool was really trying to address heat risk, both from the lens of, physical interventions to address urban heat island effect, but also thinking about the ways we can best support vulnerable populations through this lens of social resilience and social cohesion. And I won't talk through all of the layers of this plan, but I want to just emphasize that at the forefront of the thinking for this report was this idea of supporting vulnerable populations, but also working through this network of community cohesion as a way of sort of spreading information about climate preparedness and climate adaptation in general. So a major part of the work of Cool Neighborhoods was investing in tree planting. So the heat vulnerability map that the city of New York has considers a number of factors when addressing or rather considering heat vulnerability. And one of the main indicators in this map is looking at green space or lack thereof. And so in neighborhoods that were deemed heat vulnerable on the highest end of that index, the city worked with the Parks Department to do targeted tree planting. So, what this work does is over time, it will start to fill in the gaps in the city's tree canopy in these neighborhoods that were underinvested in because of redlining. And then over time, as a tree canopy sort of fills in, that will help to address urban heat island effect. And I think that this process is a really great example of using tools that are embedded with climate justice in policymaking. And so, having the tool, having the heat vulnerability index was a way for us to prioritize investments in certain areas and a way to sort of make the case as to why these investments were important. Another big part of Cool Neighborhoods NYC was the implementation of cool roofs. And so, cool roofs are these white roof coatings that can have a real huge impact in both addressing the urban heat island effect in general, but also decreasing indoor temperatures, which can have a really important impact on building energy usage in the summer months. And so again, by using the heat vulnerability index, we use that as a tool to help sort of direct investment and focus when it came to implementing cool roofs. And so on the map that you'll see, you'll find that a significant portion of the cool roof investments were made in the darker orange areas, so in the high heat vulnerable areas. And since the program started about, more than 10 years ago at this point, over 10 million square feet of white roof has been coated throughout the city through the program. And the program also focuses on providing free cool roofs to affordable housing, community centers, and other types of important social infrastructure in the city. Another big part of the work of this report was using the framing of trusted messengers as a way to deliver climate risk information. And so, part of the thinking about this work is that there are, for many reasons, some populations that are harder for the city to reach directly. These can be folks who are socially isolated or are homebound because of mobility issues, or for many reasons may not have trust in the government. And so we know that home health aides are really critical parts of the care infrastructure in the country and in the city. And in partnering with home health aid agencies, we provided climate risk trainings. And so now these home health aid workers were able to work with their clients to sort of guide them on what best to do if there's a heat wave event. Everything from suggesting that their clients turn on the air conditioning to encouraging them to drink more water, or sort of connecting them to city resources that are available during a heat wave event. And this type of infrastructure is really this focus on sort of more intimate one-to-one connections and sort of soft relationship building as a tool of sort of sharing resources and information when it comes to climate adaptation. So another example of this trusted messenger concept is Be a Buddy NYC. And so this is a program where the city partnered with community-based organizations that are currently working in heat vulnerable neighborhoods to basically serve as buddy systems during a heat wave event. And so the organizations that we chose to work with are organizations that have long and rich connections in their communities. And again, they're oftentimes better situated and have better sort of trust networks to reach out to neighbors during heat wave events. And so these organizations were trained in understanding sort of the intersection of climate and health impacts, also trained in things like overall climate preparedness and emergency management. And then ahead of a heat wave, these organizations will call people in their communities, particularly folks who might be isolated, to again share resources about what to do when there's a heat wave, or connect them to a city program, such as a cooling center or other programs like that. And what we found is that this type of structure is really able to adapt to multiple crises in the city. So at the top of the pandemic last year, these Be a Buddy networks were actually activated to call people in the midst of COVID. And so in the first few weeks of the pandemic, these networks did thousands of wellness checks to people in their communities, basically connecting them to the city's food programs or other services to make sure that they were okay. And I think it's a really important example of the power of relationship building that needs to happen ahead of a disaster or ahead of a crisis. So when there is a crisis, people sort of know who to reach out to and have the sort of networks and the social cohesion that's really critical when trying to address these disparities of extreme weather events. So, a lot of our interventions had to drastically change because of the nature of COVID-19. One of the biggest things that we did that was different was the enactment of an air conditioning program for low-income seniors. And so this was really trying to address the fact that some of the more traditional, avenues of cooling, whether it's going to the library or a community center or senior center, wasn't as possible because of the real concerns around community transmission and, wanting to make sure that folks who were vulnerable from COVID weren't sort of putting themselves in the line of risk because of extreme heat. And so last year, the city ran an air conditioning program to provide 74,000 air conditioners to low-income seniors throughout the city as really a way to make sure that people had protective measures in their homes during extreme weather events. We also did a lot of work thinking about ways to activate open spaces to provide cooling and spaces of respite during heat wave events. And I think, this is part of the larger awakening that's been happening about just the importance and criticality of public spaces, everything from our parks to our sidewalks, but places where people can get respite and feel, get a sense of well-being in the outdoors. So that's my last slide, but really, again, happy to be here and excited for the conversation.
So our final speaker will be Dr. Kyle White. Kyle is George Willis Pack Professor of Environment and Sustainability at the University of Michigan, teaching in the Environmental Justice specialization. His research addresses environmental justice, focusing on moral and political issues concerning climate policy and Indigenous peoples, the ethics of cooperation and cooperative relationships between Indigenous peoples and science organizations, and problems of Indigenous justice in public and academic discussions of food sovereignty, environmental justice, and the Anthropocene. Kyle currently serves on the White House Environmental Justice Advisory Council, the Management Committee of the Michigan Environmental Justice Coalition, and the Board of Directors of the Pesticide Action Network North America. He has served as an author of the U.S. Global Change Research Program, including on the National Climate Assessment and for the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change Working Group 2. He's an enrolled member of the Citizen Potawatomi Nation. And I'll turn it over to you, Kyle. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Dr. Osborne, and good to be in dialogue with the esteemed colleagues here today. And I wanted to share a couple of different things. First, I wanted to talk a little bit about the White House work, and what I was going to share is certainly related to and complementary to and builds on what Assistant Director Kumar had shared with us earlier. And then I also wanted to mention a few considerations about Indigenous people in the context of the United States and climate and environmental justice. So to begin with, right now, and this really reaffirms what Assistant Director Kumar had shared with us, we're in a time where there's a tremendous amount of energy and resources and just a lot of motivated folks regarding environmental justice, especially at the federal level. Philanthropy is excited, agencies are excited, communities are excited, community organizations are excited. And a big reason why there's so much environmental justice within the Biden-Harris administration is because in so many different states, it was Black, Brown, and Indigenous people that came out and voted. Just for example, in a state like Michigan, groups like the Michigan Environmental Justice Coalition or the Anishinaabe Caucus mobilized tens of thousands of voters around environmental justice issues and were a huge part of completely changing the election trajectory of the state of Michigan in the last presidential election. And so for this reason, the Biden-Harris administration has a profound responsibility to make environmental justice matter to the communities that played such a huge role in the election, many of whom are communities that are suffering from problematic burdens of environmental stressors, environmental harms, and who also lack access to the best aspects of what it means to have a cultural lifeway or recreation or other things tied to the places where you live, work, and play. And so the White House Environmental Justice Advisory Council, which comes out of Executive Order 14008, involves 26 people who have a long experience working in environmental justice, though about 4 or 5 of them are also, I would say, kind of the next generation of environmental justice leaders, but who have demonstrated just incredible work in their short careers. But we also have many people that have been working for many decades on environmental justice and across multiple different domains and levels and so on. And so initially, the WEJAC, which is the term for the White House Environmental Justice Advisory Council, has set out with a number of tasks and subcommittees. So one of the first ones, and you can view the recommendations on our website. We made recommendations in mid-May, and the first one was actually updates to Executive Order 12898, or updates that could go into a potential new executive order on environmental justice. And so we haven't yet received a response from the White House or federal agencies on those recommendations, but it's something that those agencies are currently working on and engaging. But a key aspect of those recommendations are a recentering of the importance of Title VI of civil rights and anti-racism within the charges that agencies have to protect communities. We emphasize that environmental justice is about full protection, and is also about the sustainability and vitality of communities, including the cultural integrity of communities. We have a lot of strong recommendations on improving agency strategic planning and accountability. And so anyways, that's a key thing for folks to follow. Assistant Director Kumar referenced the Justice 40 initiative. I would say that's one of the areas that our council is the busiest in. The idea that if you look at major infrastructure investments in the tens of billions of dollars in environmental areas, so climate resilient infrastructure, renewable energy infrastructure, sanitation infrastructure, clean water infrastructure, and the workforce development that would be associated with those types of investments, that's a major commitment. And at one level, it's a macro investment commitment. But a huge part of Justice 40 is, what does it mean to make the dollars count? What does it mean to actually not only spend the dollars in a way that matters to communities and that makes real change, but to be able to also track that that's what's happening. And so really the vision behind Justice 40 is not just invest and that's it, but actually ask really hard-hitting questions like, will communities that are the focus of investments, will their own contractors and businesses benefit from the federal contracts? Will they benefit from the other energy and resources that would come into their community in relation to the federal investments? Will you have within communities new financial mechanisms and instruments developed that support those communities in taking advantage of the investments? Will communities own the new infrastructure? How do we ensure that the money just doesn't flow out of the community? And so these are extremely hard-hitting questions, and ones that are challenging for communities like tribal nations, for example, who have never been the focus of any prior federal intensification of infrastructure investment. And so many of our tribal nations are in the position where we never were once benefited from previous infrastructure investment, including things like the Rural Electrification Act. And so for an investment in, say, renewable energy to matter for our communities, we have to also at the same time address the fact that broadband infrastructure and other communications infrastructure is lacking. Water infrastructure is lacking. Transportation infrastructure is lacking. It has to be part of a concerted, planned effort. And so in this way, the Justice 40 initiative is really trying to go deep, so to speak, and is very much intergenerational, and is very much about changing how we understand the relationship between macro level investments and actual change and transformation within communities. Another aspect that the WEJAC is going into is the part of it that involves federal agencies understanding actually how to identify which communities should be focused on for the sake of Justice 40. And this is complementary with what Assistant Director Kumar was talking about with regard to EJ Screen at the national level, at the EPA level, but also more locally what states are doing to track environmental injustice. But what the WEJAC is working on is called the Climate and Economic Justice Screening Tool. And it's a screening tool that's going to use publicly available data to give voice to communities that should be the focus of different aspects of Justice 40. For example, a community that's in a high-risk climate change situation, well, infrastructure investments on climate resilience would be critical for that community. And so there is currently in development a prototype, and there's a WEJAC subcommittee that's focused on advising the U.S. Digital Service and the Office of Management and Budget and the Council on Environmental Quality on developing that prototype for the Climate and Economic Justice Screening Tool. There's also a group of software engineers at the U.S. Digital Service that has a meeting or has a set of meetings and a Slack channel and other things on the development of the screening tool. It's called the Justice 40 Open Source Group and has a GitHub website, and there's office hours. There's all sorts of opportunities to engage with that group. And I think it's important that one of the issues that we're focused on is that if so much hinges on the development of the screening tool in terms of giving voice to communities that could really benefit from the Justice 40 initiative and could really have a transformative effects from that, it's important who's designing the screening tool, who's engineering it. And oftentimes our communities face digital divides, and we might have experiences and knowledge and expertise related to justice and equity, but oftentimes people in the position to engage in software engineering and design don't have those experiences, yet are in the position to make critical recommendations and build out things that are going to have a pivotal role in the future well-being of many of our communities. And lastly, and this is one of the subcommittees I co-chair, we're working on a scorecard, and Assistant Director Kumar had this in one of their slides, an overall scorecard to support agencies to track their environmental justice efforts. And we hope after a number of discussions with agencies, with different key White House offices, that by February we'll have an available version of that scorecard that could be shared publicly. So all of this means that for folks with spatial skills and geographic skills and others, there's so much to do right now. This is where the action is. And I think for tribal nations, this is critical because for many of our communities, we've been tracking climate change for many generations. Our vulnerability to climate change is related both to the fact that we live in areas that are facing climate change impacts, but our capacity to adapt and some of the reasons why we're confined to certain geographic areas is because it's the fossil fuel industry that was a huge driver in dispossessing us of our lands in the first place, shrinking our territories, and getting us to be relocated in different ways, as well as even in the case of a lot of reservations or areas where tribes have recognized forms of sovereignty, the liquidation of those parcels of land into private property that non-native people control or lease and essentially take advantage of our lands. And so nearly every infrastructure period in the US, infrastructure building left us behind, as I mentioned earlier. And so we're looking in a situation where we're some of the most adamant environmentalists in the world in terms of indigenous people. But many of the folks that will be making decisions about these large investments don't understand our communities, don't understand our history. Yet to be able to succeed in the era of Justice 40, we're going to have to use our own knowledge and experience to guide how those planning efforts are made, how those investments are made. And so I'll just close with those points. And again, fantastic to be in dialogue with the esteemed colleagues here, as well as folks that are connecting to this conversation in different ways.
Thank you so much, Dr. White. So I think let's move into our portion of where I'll pose a number of questions to our panelists. And maybe we'll start with you, Kyle. Maybe you can address this question, and then we'll ask a couple of other questions to some of our other panelists. But maybe we'll start with this one. What lessons would you say do past experience in fighting environmental justice offer for efforts to promote climate justice today? So both the successes and failures in fighting environmental justice, what do these past experiences offer for thinking about and promoting climate justice today?
Yeah, I appreciate the question. So I think when I think about just all the testimonies and things I've learned about what Native people in the context of the US are facing with respect to climate change, there's a couple of ways I think about how we approach the idea of what we can learn in the past. So one thing is that indigenous cultures oftentimes have stories from long time ago about previous periods where societies faced climate change, including dangerous climate change. And even if we, kind of made the claim that, like, historically, we know it couldn't possibly have been humans that caused it in terms of, like, greenhouse gas emissions, nonetheless, in those stories, they're about people taking responsibility for the changes that were happening and that were threatening. And what we find in those different stories, and obviously there's a number of different cultures and so on, but at least in a lot of the stories that I'm familiar with, the solution is never more technology or more technological innovation, but rather people's capacity to deal with climate change is a function of how social relations work. If you have a society or multiple societies and people are interacting with each other in ways where there's high degrees of consent and trust and reciprocity and accountability, then that's like the kind of society that I would want to be a part of, right? It's a society where you've got mutual aid and support. For that reason, and thinking about Daphne Lundy's presentation regarding the buddy system, and you're right, you get that social fabric, and that's what really goes into resilience. And historically, what we've seen is that every time the United States tried to address a crisis, they committed they committed acts of colonialism. Tribes were dispossessed of their land to make way for the energy sector and the industrial sector. And what we see along the way is that the U.S. was able to do that because they didn't respect Native people's consent. They didn't want non-exploitative or reciprocal economic situations with tribes. They also were distrustful. And I think it's important that if we don't look closely at how the United States operates today and other countries in the world, if we don't look closely about whether those aspects of trust and consent, reciprocity have been improved, then the climate solutions are likely to be just as hazardous to many indigenous communities and many Black and Brown communities, both in the United States, but also within the global majority. And so we need to look very closely, not at whether we have the technologies, but actually whether we've repaired things that Black, Brown, and indigenous people have been calling for repair for many generations at this point. And I think some of the data, unfortunately, some of the case studies shows us that renewable energy and clean energy solutions can actually create a future for many Black, Brown, and indigenous communities, which is horrible. It involves more environmental degradation, more land loss, while maybe privileged people will benefit in a bubble from the reduction in greenhouse gas emissions.
Yeah, no, thank you so much for those reflections. So I've got a, well, first of all, let me actually open it up to the panelists. If anyone else would like to respond to that question. I mean, you all have a long history of working on these issues of environmental justice, and I think are in positions right now where, as you all have been mentioning, environmental justice is really being taken seriously. In the federal, the national level, as well as in the levels of states and cities. So let me also open it up to the other panelists if you want to respond to that question.
I think I would just echo the framework that Dr. Weitz laid out, particularly the point around trust needing to be repaired and like healing needing to happen ahead of trying to create these interventions to address climate hazards. I think that's definitely the case in New York City. So much of what we know that drives heat vulnerability specifically is about racism. It's about where Black and Brown people could and could not live. It's about how we chose not to invest in those neighborhoods. And it's I think sometimes conversations around climate adaptation can be in a way too narrow, because it's oftentimes not just about the hazard, it's about these sort of interconnected disparities and inequality. And I think if we're not trying to sort of create solutions that at its heart are addressing these historic lack of trust that communities have with governments, if we're not addressing these really deep-seated, racist policies that we're still feeling today, it's then hard to come up or sort of adapt and sort of recommend solutions, because we won't have those relationships to really make those those interventions fruitful. And then again, I think again to really affirm what Dr. Weitz said, this idea of I think learning from the past is so critical, because again, even in a place as dense and complex as New York City, people have been thinking about environmental justice and climate justice for decades. And so how are we also understanding community community perspectives and community values in this work as a city, as we're shaping our policies and programs.
Yeah, thank you so much. So maybe I'll pose this question to Assistant Director Kumar. So what are the most promising opportunities to make progress on environmental and climate justice that you see today?
Yeah, thank you so much. I do feel, again, the moment we're in right now, with the amount of enthusiasm there is, the amount of attention there is, and the ability to move money right now to fund priorities that we think are important, is an exciting moment. Right now in the House Democrats' proposal that's on the street is $550 billion worth of investment that's going to flow. I mean, this is an unprecedented conversation that's happening in my entire career in 20 years. There's never been a moment where there was actually contemplation of increasing EPA's budget or the budget of the agencies that do environmental work. It's always been a shrinking and zero-sum game in terms of shifting resources to different priorities. So the idea that we're in conversation about this is really exciting. I think I just can't stress enough what my co-panelists said, though, about what scares me the most is that we're going to unleash all of this money on communities that have never had the capacity for all of the systematic reasons. They've been disenfranchised. They've never had the ability to be in these conversations or the tools or resources. And all of a sudden, this money is going to start flowing forward through the existing pipes of government. We are shoving this money through federal programs that were broken to begin with, that have done the damage to begin with. So the idea of how do we simultaneously retrofit the systems so that they can be more just is the challenge of our day. And it just requires a stepping up in thinking and in ambition, and the ability for people who are to step into brave spaces and change conversations, challenge the assumptions, and say it in all of these places. What we're fortunate, what I feel really excited about is we have forums like the one that Dr. White is serving on, that we have young people who are coming into spaces. We have Daphne, you in roles that you're sharing, that there are cities that are leading on these issues, that are thinking about things in different ways, that we have the ability to bring people together to say, no, let's think about it in this different way before you set forth on the old ways of doing business. And I just think it's going to take that much work from outside stakeholders pushing back and holding us accountable as government, as public institutions. It's going to take philanthropy to meet communities at their needs where federal agent or any public entity is not able to. There are lots of things we can't fund for legal reasons but communities need help to do. And it's that it can't be all driven by top down. It has to be listening to the grassroots and what folks are doing. And it's hard work. So it's going to take a lot, and it's exciting. I think people are really ready to do that, meet that challenge.
Yeah, no, it's definitely extremely exciting. Let me also open it up to the other panelists, and thanks also for speaking to some of the pressing challenges today. So maybe I'll that kind of broader question: what are some of the pressing challenges, but also promising opportunities to make progress on environmental and climate justice? Maybe I'll open it up to the other panelists if you want to speak to that.
I think, especially as we're still in the midst of the pandemic, it's been really heartening to see the role of social infrastructure be elevated. And so, again, I think that from a resiliency conversation, people go to the coastal protection projects, like the big projects, like the hard infrastructure. But I think that now there's really an acknowledgement that this softer infrastructure, this social infrastructure, is critical, if not more so, to the sort of hard infrastructure that comes to people's minds. And so I think on a New York City level, that's opened up really important conversations about the roles of libraries, of community centers, of trusted neighborhood spaces, and how do we ensure that those spaces just continue to function in their amazing roles as building social networks, but also that we're thinking about these sites and the existing and future challenges that they might face because of climate change. And really trying to think about how we reimagine even grant programs from the federal level that traditionally, I think, addressed climate adaptation from a very hard infrastructure lens, to then opening up the conversations to invest in more social infrastructure and also invest in programming as well, right? How do we ensure that the people at these different sites, like doing this community work, have access to the many funding streams that are that exist, but are also coming because of the current federal landscape that we're in right now.
No, thank you so much. So I've got one final question, and I'd love the thoughts of the entire of all of our panelists on this final question, because young people are deeply concerned about the climate crisis, and are also recognizing some of the limits to the sort of conventional strategies, much of what you've all have shared. So what advice would you give to young people interested in working to achieve climate justice? Maybe we'll start with you, Daphne, if you don't mind, and we can start with you this time.
Sure. I'll say first that anytime I interact with young people, I always think that they're at the forefront of these conversations around climate justice, because for them, I think they're oftentimes thinking about the span of their lifetime, and how things will have to change and how they'll have to adapt because of these climate change impacts. And so I think for folks, particularly young folks that want to get involved in this work, I always think about ways to start from where you are. So thinking about sort of the local groups that are in your landscape, thinking about the elders in your neighborhood that are probably already thinking about climate hazards, or thinking about environmental justice as a really great place to start that work. And then I think another thing to consider, and especially given the audience of this conference, is the fact that data and tools, particularly maps, can tell a story, but it's oftentimes not the only story. And I think that when we can get better about melding both the really important, quantitative work that we can do using data sets and resources with the qualitative work of talking to people on the ground and sort of understanding that texture of experience and lived experience in this work, that's how we get at sort of better policies and programs that really speak to this more holistic picture of what community needs are.
Yeah, thank you so much. And maybe I'll turn it over to you, Chitra. Maybe what kind of advice would you give to young people today interested in climate justice?
Yeah, I just want to pick up on one thing that Daphne said in terms of like the enthusiasm by young people. I mean, there was a Yale study on public opinion that actually said that it concluded that people of color are more likely to vote in favor of climate policies because they are closer to the impacts, likely. And similarly, that young people are more likely to vote in favor of climate policies, and that's known. And several folks have, several reports have said that. So what I also think about is this quote by Albert Einstein, which is, we cannot solve problems by using the same kind of thinking we used when we created them. So who better to use a totally different type of thinking than our young people? Because we need to shape this generation, or we need to let loose the talents of our younger generations who haven't been melded by an old way of thinking and to help solve the problems of tomorrow. I mean, I really believe that there are technologies that haven't been invented yet that are going to help with mitigating climate change or avoiding new sources of pollution. As our country grapples with all of these issues like broken supply chains and workforce shortages, there's really no dearth of opportunity for young people to step into the roles, to step into the new needs, and be the change we want to see in the world. So it's really, I just say like that for young people not to feel ever limited, to really step in to opportunities, to challenge assumptions and go with it.
Thank you so much. And finally, Kyle, would love to hear your thoughts. I mean, obviously, as a professor, you probably get this question quite often, so I'd love to hear your thoughts as well.
Absolutely. I really appreciated Deputy Director Lundy's points about storytelling and narrative, and I wouldn't have said it as well, but I would have definitely emphasized that if they hadn't have said it just now. I think for Black, Brown, and Indigenous youth, it's important that we're centering our cultures, our sciences, our knowledge, and keeping open that option that maybe our careers for the long term can be within our communities. We need to break that cycle of understanding our careers as, being somewhere else. Certainly we have a place in those somewhere else locations, one of which is a place like where I work, but we really want to have those options to have long-term or short-term careers within our own communities. A couple of super specific points, given the great points that my colleagues here have already made. So one is that I think there's a tremendous opportunity for young folks to be part of these next steps with respect to issues of fossil fuel divestment. Many philanthropic organizations, for example, are divesting their portfolios from dirty industries. But what does it mean as a next step to then reinvest in communities and in a way that still meets those philanthropic organizations' needs for being able to grow their financial portfolio? And I think young people can play a huge role in creating that completely different way of thinking about investments. Another area is in terms of higher education. There's a massive crisis right now in higher education, including with the debt crisis that many younger people are facing. Part of the problem is that institutions of higher education, especially the most expensive ones, are typically not the ones that are in our communities. And right now, many institutions of higher education are engaged in huge amounts of fundraising because they believe that they will have access to unprecedented levels of endowment and philanthropic support, mainly due to the issues that many people in our communities have been raising and that have been in the media for some years now. But because the universities with the biggest fundraising arms are not the ones right there benefiting our communities, that can be very problematic. And I think that we need to push for our institutions to partner with the institutions of higher education in our communities, the minority-serving communities, the historically Black colleges and universities, the tribal colleges and universities, and begin to look at partnered fundraising and begin to start closing some of those gaps and actually working together instead of having to continue with this horrific divide between both institutions and who they're serving and who has access to them, but also in terms of who can get the larger share of funds.
Thank you so much. I think we're at time, but this has been a very interesting conversation. And so I thank the panelists for the work that you're doing in the world and also for these important insights on environmental and climate justice. So thank you so much. And I think we'll close now.